presentations. One is, two of those are by Stephan Klasen's team, and he will introduce how the team did that. The first one will turn over to you, and you're going to tell us also how your team tagging that and who did the paper and so on. Because all the work is done by large teams, and not everybody is here, so it probably is good if you just tell who the people were and how they presented.
Sure, sure, sounds good. Thank you. So this is like, you could call it a follow-up on our earlier presentation in the day, but this is more of a systematic review that we did on the subject of childcare, trying to understand what has been done in the past and how that could influence our work. So it was largely done by Nicole Austin, Sam Harper, and Arijit Nandi. None of them are here, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them down and pass them on to them. So just a word of caution, yeah. So don't ask me questions. Okay. Okay, so based on the systematic review, I'm just going by what I have on paper. It's still a draft, so it's a work in progress. But what we find is childcare responsibilities have been, like, it is acknowledged that it falls primarily on women all over the world, especially in low and middle income countries. In rich countries, women have to have access to center-based childcare services wherein they can drop their kids to a center, and the same has shown some positive impact on the studies that have been done in developed countries. But there is limited evidence of the impact of such services in low-income countries. We also see that access to childcare services, it's observed, or it's believed that it may increase maternal employment rates and thus empower women. But empowerment in turn has positive impacts on women's health, social outcomes, and position within the household and dynamics of decision making. Most systematic reviews that have been done in the past, they look at the impact of childcare on children's outcomes, and there is not much work that has been done on how these childcare facilities affect maternal outcomes. So there is just one literature review that examines the effect of childcare on maternal economic outcomes, that too in Latin America, but maternal outcomes only with reference to economic outcomes, and there's no mention of health or social outcomes. So the methods that were adopted during this systematic review were the search strings were built after registering the systematic review in Prospero. The primary exposure of interest was childcare, and we defined childcare with these 2 points. One is that it's formal out-of-home care for children in a public location, and second is that facilities could be education-based or care-based. That is something like that was kept open, but it needs to be formal and out-of-home care for children. And both public and private programs, it could be either a public or a private program. So that's how we define childcare while doing systematic reviews or looking for papers. The primary outcomes of our interest were women's health, social outcomes, and economic outcomes. And we did not restrict ourselves to only economic outcomes, because we see that there is an interplay between health and economic outcomes and social and economic outcomes as well. So the inclusion criteria of a paper or a study to be a part of systematic review was that were the studies that are assessing the impact of childcare as defined, as I previously defined. And the exclusion criteria were that we dropped the existing reviews, meta-analysis, or qualitative designs or policy documents out of the review, because we were looking for more rigorous assessments and studies which tend to be less biased, and studies assessing impact only children or other family members. So we did not consider studies that did not analyze the impact on maternal outcomes, and the high income countries were also dropped from the list. So the standard protocol, we did title and abstract screening, followed by, we had a team of 4 people, so 2 reviewers independently reviewed the full text version of the papers that were listed, and 2 other reviewers extracted data from the retained study of the second stage, and they used an extraction form that we designed beforehand to do this. Now, this is what happened. So we started with a number of like 1,937 papers, and we ended up with 12. There's a typo there, like there's some miscalculation there, but we ended up with 12 studies that were relevant to the subject we are working on. So a quick summary of results. So majority of these studies have been conducted in Latin America. Of the 12 papers that we reviewed, we find only one randomized evaluation that was conducted in Brazil. And again, it sees impact on maternal economic outcomes. So maternal employment rates increased by 27% and labor force participation increased by 8%. Most of the other studies, most of the remaining 11 studies were quasi-experimental in nature. One was done in Mexico, which looked at the impact of access to childcare on men, but it found it found some mixed effects on men. So how it impacted men who were employed in formal labor force and also men who were employed in informal labor force. So there the effects were mixed. The two quasi-experimental studies were done in Argentina, one in 2007, another one in 2011. And they were a little more rigorous in nature as compared to the others. And again, they looked into the impact of women labor force participation and number of working hours that increased as with some intervention that was done with children in terms of providing daycare facilities. So in all these studies so far, they are seeing positive impacts. Again, like as I mentioned earlier, we are not finding anything related to health or social outcomes. And the way women's economic outcomes are being measured, they are all self-reports, and there are no other measures of how, of the number of hours they worked or the income they earned. So it's all based on self-reporting. They show a positive relationship between exposure to formal center-based childcare and workforce participation. Impact on maternal earnings is unclear. Like we see the impact on number of hours, but impact on income is a little mixed as well, like not very significant. In some of these studies, there is a problem about quality. Like we are a little concerned because in some of them there is a mention of missed data, but they do not mention how they treat the missing data. So that ways, in both quasi-experiment and the earlier RCT that I mentioned, there are some concerns about quality. So again, like it's just a repetition of what we said, but what I said earlier. But in terms of labor force participation and earnings as well, like whatever outcomes have come up in the earlier papers, there is a heterogeneity in the magnitude of impact. So we can't conclusively say what exactly is the magnitude of impact on the number of hours of labor force participation or income. So that again is a gap there. The papers see a stronger effect on women who are not working prior to access to childcare as opposed to women who were already a part of labor force. That is maybe a point that could be considered by the earlier team working in Nairobi, where they see that 61% of the women are already a part of the labor force or income generating activities. Maybe this is something to look into and see how it could feed into their research. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's difficult to assess the heterogeneous impacts. And also, we also see in the quasi-experimental studies, there is a problem of self-selection. So the childcare services have not been randomly allocated to women or children. There is a problem of self-selection in utilizing childcare services. Again, this is something that the Nairobi study is looking into. I think the women who are not availing the services of childcare have been asked to select the daycare center that they want to. So maybe again a point that they could consider in their research. Yeah, that's it. I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear, but yeah, please do share your questions. Yeah. Yes. No, because there's not much that has been done. Yeah, frankly. Yeah.
might have given the answer to this, but when you say access to childcare,
Yeah.
when I think about that, the way a lot of childcare research has been done historically is not to say access, it's more the cost of childcare, because in some sense, childcare could exist out there, but maybe at an astronomical price.
Yeah.
So there's actually quite a lot of research in the U.S. looking at, quasi-experimentally, looking at the impact of a change in the price of childcare on women's labor force participation. Sometimes it's work that I had done was tax subsidies. David Blau had done a whole lot of work using the local cost areas. There's a lot of work on that. So I was wondering, when you're thinking of access, is that a different issue than thinking about it in terms of cost?
Yeah. So in context of the study we are doing, it's access. So like there is no such facility available to rural women apart from the government service that is there under ICDS program, as we were discussing this morning. So that is the only available service. Otherwise, access is a problem. Like it's not there. It's not too much about cost, because yeah, it's primarily about access. And we dropped developed countries off the systematic review because of this reason itself. Yeah. Sure.
But isn't basically everywhere a private costly option there? That basically you could always hire somebody to come to your house if you had enough money.
Yeah.
And in that sense, ultimately, it is a price issue.
So it is a price issue as well, but I think access comes first and then comes the pricing. So the second question that we are measuring in our study is sustainability or cost effectiveness of these models for low income households. And so these households are not earning enough to hire somebody to come to their house, right? So the study is about a rural context where 50% of the population is below poverty line, and they can't really, have access to such expensive services.
Front of Shraddha, because I also conceptually have a problem with that on pricing, because we've seen even in low-income households, we're talking about private school or private education, it's low cost. We can get into the mechanics of it, whether it's good or not, but when pricing comes into it, it does even work in low-income households. So just because it's low-income doesn't necessarily mean that conceptually, just that. There might be something else there.
Yeah. So, okay, so just to add to that, so the way the current program is working is that people do pay a fee every quarter. Every year, they pay a very small fee, which is not necessarily like the best price for that service. It's a very subsidized model, I would say, but they are paying a fee because, so the idea is the NGO that we are working with, they are building an ownership within the community. So the community hires the sanchalika or the attendant. The community also at times, if they cannot pay the fee, they are also donating in terms of food or mattresses, toys or other material. So that's also a part of it. So pricing definitely comes into it, but here in our systematic review, how to price it is not really a part of the study. So the part of the study would be the cost effectiveness of the current program as we study it, but yeah.
So I wanted to know what the ages of the children are that are accessing these childcare, and a bunch of related questions to that. Is there a correlation between the age of the child and the number of children that the woman has also wanted to understand how you're assessing the
Yeah. Right. Okay. So in our systematic review, we found that the studies that were done with children till the age of 6, we didn't really find any studies that studied the impact beyond 6 years of age. Yeah. It's different. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, but the study we are doing there, the age group is 1 to 6 years, and we have full family rosters and children rosters, so which range from age of 0 to 18. So we have data on each of the child in a household, like what that child is doing, what is the situation of vaccination or nutrition and everything. So that we have, and maybe like when we analyze the data, we can set up those links on women employment and the number of children, or the dependence rate, etc. The quality of the program, or the quality of childcare, the way we are taking care of it in our study is it's very standardized. So Seva Mandir has a very standardized program where they have one Sanchalika, where they have immunization every 6 months done, where they have people coming in to take anthropometric data, making sure that heights and weights are like signaling or indicating any cases of stunting or problems with growth. And the curriculum, the education curriculum is very standardized. So, and the Sanchalikas are trained very well to make sure that the quality is similar all across. So this is something that, this is the way that Seva Mandir works in all of their hamlets, and we are adopting the same thing. On our side, on the research, what we are doing is we have monitors, IFMR hired monitors to go into the field every quarter to take the attendance records and to take stock of the inventory and see how things are, and just to meet children and all. So that's how we are ensuring quality, but Seva Mandir has its own quality ensuring mechanisms.
I was wondering whether in the studies you've reviewed there's any discussion or analysis of the norms around using formal non-household-based, non-family provided childcare. So, I mean, even in the West, or even in the Netherlands where I live, there's norms around, when are you supposed to work as a mother of young children. So I was just wondering if that comes up at all in this literature you've reviewed.
I don't see it right now, but I can definitely check with people who did it to see if they did any contextual analysis of, what's in there. But I can surely come back to you.
Wageningen is different from the rest of the Netherlands.
Yeah, no, but context is important, definitely. The social norms and taboos, they definitely have an important role to play in women empowerment. So I'll check with them if they studied it.
Coming back to the quality of preschool education, there is, all around the world there is a lot of literature in terms of quality. And in India also, there are actually good, there is a good body of literature. And therefore, I think it would be helpful if one also goes into that. Seva Mandir has a model, and that's what you are doing.
Yeah.
But even analyzing that model, if it's possible that somebody has already looked at, if they have been doing that model for long, it's possible that that has been evaluated by somebody. It's part of some evaluation in Rajasthan. If not, then there are many other evaluations that tell you about that kind of model. Whether that kind of training is adequate, what happens, what doesn't happen, what kind of resources they need. And it will be good to kind of address or analyze Seva Mandir model against these standards.
Quality indicators.
Yeah, so that, even analyzing your results will be easier.
Sure, sure.
So 2 points. One, and I don't see that reflected here, and maybe it's a conversation we're having about what was included. If you end up with only 12, and then as you say, one of the challenges of systematic reviews is the quality of what you have. So you only have 12, and then there's limited but then the advantage of that is being able to look across the board, which you've lost with the exclusion. So with things like grey literature or other things that perhaps you could have looked at, again bolstering Jyotsna's point, it might be that your inclusion criteria might need a little adjustment. I don't know whether that's possible, but that's a conversation. Yeah. And then the second part of that, once you've done all this work on the systematic review, what happens is your database, all the literature that you collected, even if it's just on the titles, it's there and sitting, is already categorized. Yeah. So, and this is a conversation that's others that if we can share that categorization, it actually helps others who might want to look at that same data set but in different ways and ask
Yeah.
different questions. And again,
Yeah.
so there might be a way, even if this is done, to reuse that information to look at other
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. We have that database and we have those categories, so we can always share it with others. That's okay. And yeah, so the quality is something that I think we were missing mainly because it's not a part of the study as that is a constant or a given, but we can definitely look into it as an aspect. And yeah, maybe we could look into some of the research in developed countries. Maybe that could help us in doing, in adding more to it. But I think the problem here was that there is not much research in developing countries in this. Yeah. But in
There,
yeah.
I think back to the gray literature conversation
Yeah.
about what else is out there.
Yeah.
How your
Yeah.
research
Sure.
Add to that is it's the definition of a systematic
Yeah.
review that's important. That is given a very specific definition. People, you know, who are trained as anthropologists, sociologists, are like it isn't very systematic because all you do is choose quasi experiments and RCTs. That's done for a very good reason, but it
Yeah.
has a particular definition.
Yeah.
Right? And I think probably Simon come back to that later. And I think it's important, certainly for a broader audience, to describe
Yeah.
it. Making it available for firms. So
Yeah.
that if there's 1,400 studies, they must be able to say something about
Yeah.
the crisis of interest.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe
But-
we could
But to be fair,
surely look into it.
this is how the systematic review is defined, and that's how you come to those
Yeah,
results.
yeah. So maybe we need to redo our definitions. That could filter in more papers, but or make it clear. Yeah, yeah. So if there are 12, there are 12. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think that the reason you didn't get a lot that had a lot of quality is because you excluded articles that looked at child outcomes only. Because I suspect that's where the action is in terms of people don't have theories about why quality would affect a woman's outcome.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you were to include them,
Yeah.
you'd get quality.
Yeah. But then do you think, so the outcomes that we are studying, like they are not, the primary outcomes are not related to children. So like, do you think putting in, like listing in those papers in our review would help at all? Because if we are not studying it at all, then, you know,
Well, the thing is,
it's a different objective. Yeah.
I mean, parents are going to pay attention to how happy their child is. So quality, I think, matters in the sense that not so much. I think whether or not people use daycare is enormously affected by their perceptions of how safe the environment is, and whether or not the environment is actually making their child thrive. So.
Yeah, I just joined. I'm Sebastian Vollmer from Göttingen. So I was wondering how exactly you define like quasi-experiments and where you drew the line, like what counts as credible evidence and what does not.
I won't say like credible or not credible evidence, because like there are pros and cons of each and every method, right? So like even in our research, we can't say that if we are doing an RCT, that's the end of it, like that's the gold standard and that's what it is, because we also have to, you know, in order to complete the story, we also did FGDs and, you know, a lot of other qualitative instruments we employed on the ground. So I won't say that quasi-experiments are not credible, but there are some, the rigor is definitely missing there, right? So we were just talking about where the limitations are clearly mentioned in the paper, that there is missing data in my research. If authors are, you know, acknowledging that fact that there are problems of missing data, that's what I quoted were issues in terms of quality with quasi-experimental. No, like it was acknowledged as a limitation. I'm saying that that was authors themselves acknowledged that, you know, there was a lot of missing data on these important variables, and that's why we couldn't get into more analysis. So I'm saying that from the authors, it's not, it's authors commenting on their work themselves. No.
Okay, I'm going to stop the discussion. because we're running out of time.
Yeah. No, but that's a unending debate on, you know, what method is the best method. And
The one I would add is that like, we looked at you have looked at the impact of labor force participation, a discussion on women's economic empowerment. To come back to the point that Gretchen made, the 70% of women that now got childcare and did not enter the labor force might well have been more empowered in other dimensions, of course, right? It's a very specific, and I think that's the strength of it. It's a very specific question with very rigorous evidence in that narrow sense. The moment you broaden it, you lose that.
yeah, because in some settings RCTs are not possible, right? So you have to go quasi-experimental way, and that's the way to do it. So I'm not saying that they are not rigorous, but I'm saying in our current setting, if RCT is possible, then
Thank you very much. Sorry, we have to move on to we have 2 more presentations in the next hour. Thank you very much. The other 2 presentations are also based on systematic reviews. The first one is on the links between women, the impact of women's economic empowerment to economic growth. This is in a way the core of, I think Frank commented on that, GrOW is all about the win-win. I think it's only a very small part that actually looks at that aspect, and similar to some of the other aspects we said. In this case in particular, for the GrOW program, we thought there's so much evidence out already that the best way to inform the program with this is to ask somebody to do a systematic review, which Stephan very kindly took up.
Okay, so here I am again. So, but as I said last time, then next 2 days I have no presentation. This is basically a team consisting of Marcella, Sebastian, and I were awarded the contract of GrOW 3, which was the systematic review on the impact of women's economic empowerment on economic growth. And the way we are dealing with this is that we split up the work into 4 different bits. The first one is a kind of literature review of the theoretical literature on mechanisms of how female economic empowerment can affect economic growth. That's not a systematic review in that sense of the word. It's basically just identifying what the literature has found as theoretical mechanisms, and that work is ongoing. Then we have a systematic review of the cross-country literature, and I'll talk more about that. Then we have a systematic review of the micro-evidence on the direct impact of female economic empowerment, and Marcella will talk a little bit about that. And then we have a systematic review of the micro-evidence on generational impacts by education and health. And Sebastian is leading a team on that, but we won't be presenting on that today. So we're just presenting on 2 and 3. So, systematic review of the macro evidence. There are basically, let me first say, there are 4 involved. So it's Anna Minasian, Julian Senker, Sebastian Forman, and I who are doing this. So what we're trying to do here is uncover economy-wide effects. Which is of course not the usual thing you do with systematic reviews when you're actually looking across micro effects, but that's to some degree the point of the whole GrOW program, is looking at the big picture. And what we're doing in this systematic review is trying to look at the big picture. So basically we're exploring cross-country and within-country variation in policies and approaches, and to try to see if there is robust evidence that gender gaps are associated with higher or lower economic growth. What's the advantage of doing this at the macro level via micro? Well, of course, looking at economy-wide effects, you're capturing gender equilibrium effects, spillovers, the overall effects. On the other hand, of course, your identification is much harder. You're often not observing direct policies, but you're observing kind of trends in education or in employment and link that to trends in economic growth. So that, of course, identification is a tougher issue. When we then started looking at this, we found out, which our keynote speaker, Karen Brown, also said last night, there's a large literature and somewhat mature literature on the impact of gender inequality in education on economic growth. And since the systematic review is always kind of backward-looking, that then ends up being the focus of our analysis, because there are a large number of reasonably comparable studies. The results are not all the same. There are some actually claim that gender inequality promotes growth. A few studies, and that have a particular setup. They are all associated with Robert Barrow and co-authors, and various ways of how they've used that particular specification. There are lots of other studies that have shown the opposite. So that also makes it interesting to do a systematic review. The third reason is because, in a sense, the focus on education has the clearest link to growth theory, to well-defined mechanisms. So if you look at health or decision-making or whatever other things we could be looking at economic empowerment, the question, what that link to growth theory is much more tenuous. Surely it can be made, but here we don't have to invent anything. It's out there. The growth theory is out there, and all we're doing is looking at the gendered nature of human capital and what impact that has. We also looked at some other outcomes, some other inequalities, employment, pay, control of resources, and so on. And there are very, very few studies. And the ones that exist are also of somewhat lower quality, so there really isn't a mature literature that one could review. One could, literally discuss individual studies and their pros and cons, but a review wouldn't make sense. How do we delimit this? So we look at all cross-country and cross-regional studies, investigate the terms of per capita income or of economic growth. So that's our left-hand side. We will look at regression analyses, so no kind of bivariate plots or qualitative studies. As independent variables, it has to be a male and a female education indicator, both included. So it can be completion, enrollment, years of schooling, so on, or the difference or the ratio. But it can't be just female education or just male education. It has to be both of them in there or in some form in relation to each other. Then we are in the process of doing a meta-analysis, so we're not there yet. And there we will delimit it further, that we will only look at the cross-country and panel analyses to include in the meta-analysis. We have about 10 or 15 studies that do time series analyses, so basically that relate growth in Pakistan to gender gaps in Pakistan, annual data, 30 years. And there are about a dozen of those studies. We will review them separately, but they're really quite incomparable to the other stuff that we're doing here. So, in my personal view, is they're of somewhat lower quality, but that's of course a time series econometricians might argue with me about that. Okay, so let's look at our search strategy. So we did not only look at publications, but looked at the grey literature as well. So we have, so we did a lot of experimentation. So initially we started with tens of thousands of studies, and then kind of came down to a reasonable search strings that actually capture what we want to have, made sure that all the studies were there, that we knew had to be there, but also made sure that we didn't have too much redundant stuff. So we looked in EBSCO, IDS WebPack, that's grey literature. Web of Science is, of course, publication. Google Scholar is a mixture. We had different search strings that yielded large numbers of records. And then we also looked at forward citations. That's the advantage of Google Scholar. So there are 4 relatively well-known studies that get a lot of citations, and so we looked at forward citations of those studies. We looked at backward citations on the 50 most relevant ones from Econ Lit. And in Google Scholar, we only looked at the first 300. They're listed by relevance. We took the first 300 and then stopped. We got 28,000, and but by that point, it was quite clear that it was all noise and no signal anymore. Then we did title abstract screening. So then we got to 264 potentially eligible studies. Then we did look at eligibility. Again, 2 people separately screening full text. Then the numbers went down quite drastically. And when we excluded duplicates, we ended up with 53 studies that are included in the systematic review. Of those 53, I think 21 are these time series studies, so they will be put aside and looked at separately. 32 of those studies are these cross-section and panel studies that we're looking at more carefully. So just a little bit on methods used. So, and this is, many studies have many regressions, often using several methods. So often you have a study using OLS and IV, or a pooled panel and a fixed effect, and so on. And that's why they don't add up. So we have 13 studies that use OLS, 5 IV, and there are 13 studies that are purely cross-section. So each country is one observation. The other 21 studies are panel studies. Something seems to be wrong in the heading up these things. So we need to check, and then 8 of them just do full OLS, 13 random effects, fixed effects, sure, 13 IV GMN, and then 8 others. Altogether, we have 374 regressions. So we have 32 studies, but 374 regressions, and that's actually going to be an issue to think about how to deal with that. Some studies have lots of regressions, lots of specifications. It turns out also the gray literature tends to have more than the published ones. I think that's what journal editors do, is basically say, relegate 5 of your tables to the working paper version of your paper. And so there is a bias here already, that if we just looked at every regression as an observation, we would actually overweight the gray literature. And of course, we have to deal with the fact that when you have many regressions in the same study, they are essentially using the same data, not always, but essentially the same data, so we have at least cluster standard errors at the study level. Okay, so this is in a sense as far as substance, as far as we are with substance here. So here you see the number of regressions. So we have 158 regressions where female and male education variables are included separately in the regression. And 32% find the female regression coefficient is greater than 0 and significant. 18% find the female coefficient is greater than the male coefficient and it's significant. Which means, actually, if you just look at these studies, there would not be a lot of evidence that gender gaps in education promote economic growth. These are the studies that many of them follow this Barrow specification. And the Barrow specification is basically use growth on the left-hand side, use initial year. So if you have growth, let's say from 1960 to 1990, you have the male education level in 1960, the female education level in 1960, and you do not include regional dummy variables. And actually, you could try that out yourself. If you download a data set and try that, you will get the Barrow result. which is that you will get male education has a positive impact on economic growth. Depends, of course, what other control values you have, but usually you get that result. Female education will have no impact or sometimes even a negative one. There's a large literature on that that has investigated why that is so. So there are papers that have, and basically there are 3 reasons that play a role. First one is if you don't control the regions, basically what happens is that it's all because of Latin America and East Asia. Latin America started off in the 60s with relatively high levels of female education, but the growth was underwhelming between 60 and 90. So basically in that regression, the women's education is blamed for the poor growth performance of Latin America. Conversely, East Asia actually wasn't doing that well on female education relative to male education in 1960, but it grew fantastically well since then. Again, the large gap is attributed to having promoted that. So as soon as you include regional dummy verbs, the results disappear. So there's another thing, it has to do with the coloniality. So those are the type of things that we will need to investigate much more carefully in the meta-analysis. Partly as a response to the problems of this type of work, also because there's high multicoloniality between male and female education at the country level, a bunch of people started using differences or ratios where that issue is somewhat less severe. There we have 212 regressions of ratios, 4 with differences. And there in 75% of the cases, the female-male coefficient is greater than 0. And the p-value is less than, so it's significant. And of the 4, half of them show also the difference is positive and significant. So if you just look at the ratio studies, one gets the impression the weight of the evidence suggests higher female education relative to male education promotes economic growth. That's descriptive statistics in a sense as far as we are. So the next steps I just want to talk about is we're going to do some sort of quality rating of the studies, partly based on methods and data, but mostly we want to base it on whether they have good justification for the identification they chose. It may be the case, although I think in our particular setting is unlikely, that a pure OLS cross-section regression could be well identified if you have a good reason for arguing that, but it would have to be demonstrated in the paper that this is a reasonable approach. And so basically it's going to be a subjective assessment of how well have they, these studies, dealt with identification and whether it is credible, and that's how we're going to assign quality rating. Of course, we have publications, we have great literature. We will this way be able to compare publications with great literature. We're not necessarily certain that publications are necessarily of higher quality. There is a partly just a time lag issue. Some papers just take years to get published. Some never get published because authors just give up after the 10th journal or sometimes after the second one. And also there are, of course, bad journals and that publish anything. So we shouldn't be so sure that published means necessarily better. An important issue is going to be weighting. You know, we have this 374 regressions, and we want to do extensive robustness checks of how to approach this. One, of course, would be to say, let's just always focus on the preferred regression from the authors. Then we basically be down to 32 regressions and could try to see what the results are for that. Sometimes authors have more than one preferred regression. Of course, the other one would be, other extreme would be saying we take all regressions that are in there that fit, and we attach a weight to them. So basically, if a paper has 20 regressions, each regression gets 1/20th of the weight, and then we, of course, that also ways in between, but then it gets quite complicated and possibly arbitrary to say, this was just a simple regression that doesn't count, and this is the one that has the right set of covariates. And partly we're trying to capture that in meta-analysis ourselves anyway. You know, a regression that just, for example, is just bivariate will then show up in the meta-analysis having no covariates, having no other regional dummies or whatever. So in a sense, through the meta-analysis, we hope to deal with this effect. But at the very least, of course, we will cluster standard errors at the study level. There's a more tricky issue, which I just want to allude to, is of course one can argue some studies are not, even though they're different papers, they may not be entirely independent of each other because they rely on the same data set, or at least for some of the variables rely on the same data set. So there's a famous Barrow-Lee education data set that lots of people use. It's now the kind of the standard data set is being used on years of schooling. In fact, now UNESCO Institute of Statistics is using it as the official data, for example, for the UN Human Development Index. Lots of papers use that data. So in that sense, of course, these papers are somewhat related to each other, although often they use different time periods, different indicators, and so on. So that's a tricky issue to deal with. Then we need to define our covariates for the systematic review. Of course, there will be some standard ones, published, not published, what kind of covariates are there, methods, dummies, but we'll have to do a lot of robustness. And then we will do our meta-analysis. So that's all I wanted to say on this. And I guess we could either take questions or Marcella can talk about her stage of the micro review. Yeah, maybe we take some questions, yeah. Or comments.
I have a question about the levels of education versus the difference or the ratio. So in the papers that use the difference or the ratio, do they control for the levels as well? Because I can imagine that there's some correlation between the two. Like once every man is educated, the gap has to start closing, right? So you would tend to see that some kind of inverse U or U-shaped relationship between average educational attainment levels and the differences between men and women.
Yes, a lot of studies do, but not all. Quite a few have average levels of education plus the ratio, or sometimes they have male education plus the ratio, but sometimes they just have the ratio. And of course that creates an incomparability again, because if you kind of take the first derivative, it's different between the studies. That's something we need to, that will make the results somewhat less comparable, but of course that's the same in all systematic reviews.
I know when we were first will there be enough literature? And I think you answer that by narrowing it and being happy to question. But then when I look at the process has it been more than expected work? It feels like it should just is the literature, even with this, as you say, the literature on this is much more mature than on other aspects. But do you feel that there is enough out there that you're looking at?
Yes, first.
You're still doing it.
Yes, at first it has been a lot more work than we thought. Because I think particularly once you go to the grade literature, the scope gets very wide. People write master's theses on this type of stuff, and they end up somewhere on the web. And so the search has been a very, very long process. We came up with different approaches of defining search strings, that we made sure that we have what we want to have. So this has been very arduous, and the extraction also turns out to be quite arduous, because ultimately we're now having these 374 regressions, which is a lot of information to extract for the meta-analysis. But on the good side, of course, I think we will get something here. I think it's quite clear that there's going to be an outcome, that it's in principle possible to do a meta-analysis. The homogeneity of the studies is big enough. So I think in that sense, that's a good news. But of course, maybe some of you will say, well, it's just a big yawn, because you know, you're looking at gender gaps in education. That's the possibly by now at the cutting edge the least interesting ones, and one would have wanted to know about the gender gaps in decision-making power or whatever, and what impact that has. But there's nothing there.
Basically, it confirms what Duflo said in 2013, right? That this is where we have most evidence, and there is evidence that on the whole it's positive, right?
Yes, I think that's right. It'll over-confirm it. I think we'll have quite a bit more precision on, first, more systematic assessment and more precision of the size of the effects and whether it really matters. You know, I think she's basically says, well, it's more like a second-order issue, and her argument is it makes a difference, but it's not big. Here, some studies seem to suggest it's quite big. But that I think we'll be able to sort out more clearly. Well, possibly at the regional level. Now, most of these things are cross-country studies, so each country is one observation, and of course we can't repackage them. So we can't take the country observation from different studies together in one new regressions. Some studies do regional disaggregation. That we can use, and I guess we should use to the extent that's possible, and we will. Country level is virtually impossible. There, the time series studies may be helpful. They're all at the country level, if you believe that kind of thing. That's, you know, essentially one is relating 2 times you have 20 data points and trying to make a causal inference out of that. You know, I think there are advanced methods of trying to do that. But of course, there's a question, particularly, for example, on what's the right timing? You know, if I correlate gender gaps in education with growth in a country, when exactly do I expect the effect to happen? This year, next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? The cross-country literature has the advantage, it always looks at long time periods, and that way can partly address this problem.
I have many more questions for another day. Thank you very much. This is a lot of work, and I think it's very important that it is done in that systematic system. The last presentation for today. All right. Also a systematic review by a similar different team, also based in Göttingen, to be precise. Marcella will tell us all about it, who did it, and what you did, and what you found so far.
Okay, so we didn't do it so far, and we are still in the process of doing it. So this is just a very early jet to say much about what are the impacts and whether it works. So we are now at the stage of preparing protocols and at the stage of setting up the research strategy. So at this point, it's really early. We don't have any study yet, and we didn't do any data search at a greater extent, so it's really very early. So I will be more talking about why is the motivation and why is it important to consider this or to try to do this type of studies. And this has to do with the motivation I was mentioning before. I think that one of the points that you all were complaining about my presentation is it good to have women or not? And what is the evidence? Could this really be related with development? And that is the question that we are after. What works and which type of interventions matter and matter for growth. So far, what we have been finding in the literature is that there are some systematic reviews on the impact of different types of interventions on female empowerment. We saw here some presentations on those lines, but what has not been considered so far is how these interventions impact development, or interventions that have a female emphasis, how do they affect development. What we have seen so far are some reviews with a selected sample of studies, a selected sample of countries, but there has not been use of systematic research methods. What we also see in the literature is that the studies that exist are focusing on particular type of outcomes, but they are not considering the development perspective. So what we have seen is questions regarding how does female economic empowerment affect decision making within the household? Is it affecting bargaining power, and is this related with investment in children, but not as a measure of how do we relate this with development. Our objective is to provide a systematic review of the impact of interventions that are used to promote women's economic empowerment on development. And when we are thinking about development, you have to consider that there would be, of course, an income dimension. So how does the welfare of the economic conditions of the household change? Do they manage to accumulate assets? Do they manage to reduce poverty or increase income? But what we are trying to do here is to have a more a capability approach to build up on human development perspective, where we think that what is crucial is to understand how does it change the possibility or the freedom for individuals to achieve what they want to do. And what we are thinking is about a measure that would consider a capability approach in terms of physical and mental health, related with the potential negative effects that this could have, for instance, on stress, but also the capability to engage into thinking and decision-making within the house. And as Stephan mentioned before, what we are doing is that we are focusing on interventions, or our analysis would take two different perspectives. One would be at the household as a whole, and the other perspective would be particularly focusing on the next generation, and that's what Sebastian, Fulmer, and the team could be working at. I'm being discussing therefore more about the first perspective on the household level analysis. So when we are thinking about the type of interventions out there to promote female economic empowerment, there is really a lot in the literature, and therefore our first approach was to try to understand how to classify all these types of interventions. So what we are using is the setup by Maltrova and Schuller, where they consider that the interventions could happen at three different levels: at the household, at the community, or the society level. At the household level, it would be related with access to resources in the household, so it would be related with institutional reforms that give women access to inheritance laws, to property rights over the land. At the community level, this would be related more with access to employment, with productive resources, with access to credit, and access to markets. And at the society level, this would be related to the participation of women in decision-making positions, both in entrepreneurs, but also within the government. And the emphasis, and we have here to make a cut, we will be focusing mainly on interventions that are done at the community level. And the reason why we focus on this type of interventions is that unlike the other type of interventions, community interventions normally are launched as randomized controlled trials, as an experimental approach, and therefore it allows a clear understanding or a clear identification effect when we have a control treatment, a control and a treatment, and that we can measure the impacts of intervention. So our approach would be very blind. We will be focusing only on randomized controlled trials. We will not be using quasi-experimental methods that try to control for this approach. Basically, because what we are interested is in comparing the relative effectiveness of the different interventions. So how is it best to empower women? Is it better to give them access to credit, or is it better to give them access to employment? What is the relative effect that these interventions could have on development, on human development? I have a very nice diagram of theory of change, and I will probably not go through it, but it's available in the document if there is anybody interested. And what we are saying is basically that female economic empowerment could be coming through different economic opportunities that would be having direct effects in terms of the income that is in the hands of women. You see now? Increase on bargaining power and increase of the status of the women. And that this could be related with fertility decisions in the household, decisions regarding the use of resources, bargaining power, and that this should be ultimately reflected in changes in income accumulation, assets at the household level, health outcomes, education, and particularly what we are interested in is in attitudes towards women, so about the potential long-term effects into decreasing inequalities, and lastly, on human development. In the approach, we are not only focusing on the potential positive effect of empowerment, but we are also considering potential negative effects. So we are considering also the effect on boys and girls, whether there could be disproportional effects on boys and girls, whether there could be increase in occupational hazards, or how this would be related with a double or triple burden of work at home, and eventually also with domestic violence. The methodology that we will be using is the standard methodology on systematic reuse. So we will be identifying the most common databases where there are impact evaluations, and we will do also backwards and forward citation search, and we will also be looking at multilateral organizations. So here we are also interested in GrOW literature, and we are also interested in understanding studies that are published. And here this would be more like asking you if you have studies that you think that could be interesting for us. We are doing many types of randomized control trials. We will be very happy to get them and include your citations and also your results. So following the procedures, we will be searching the title and the abstract, comparing population, impact, outcomes, and context, so whether it is related to the countries, poorly developing countries, women, and the type of interventions that we outlined before. And then we already prepared some extraction forms where we are focusing on the type of intervention, which is the groups that are beneficiary, the outcome variables in the study, and the effect size. And then we will also use a standardized form to assess the risk of bias on whether there are potential confounding effects or spillover effects on the studies, or whether there are potential bias on reporting. Finally, in the analysis, we will again use a standard method, so we will use standardized mean differences for continued outcome variables, or response ratios for dichotomous variables, and what we will try is to construct this measure of human development indicators. And this is, I think, that is one of the big challenges that we face, because it's possible that the studies are not completely comparable in terms of the variables that they include and the dimensions that they are measuring. So we will ask Stephan Klasen and consult Stephan Klasen intensively on how to build up this gap, and he has already recommended us some methodological papers on how this can be done. And we are in the process of evaluating whether there is enough evidence, whether it is possible or not to do meta-analysis, and that would be depending on whether we find enough comparability across the studies and across the outcomes that are suggested. Where we are now, we've completed the title registration, we submitted the protocol, now it's under revision. We hope to get feedback from them soon, and in the next meeting there is more coming.
Any idea how many studies you're going to be considering? Is it the scale of?
So what we see is, for instance, in the reviews that have labor markets, they are referring to 10, 12 studies. In the reviews that have to do with microcredits that are using randomized control trials, again, they would be referring to 20, 30 studies probably. But probably they do not all include the same type of outcome variables that we want. So what we're trying to do is to do a or extract the studies from the systematic reviews that has already been done. And at this point we are not yet sure how many studies will be coming.
The big question is whether any of those studies, because most of the studies will get to halfway in your theory of change, whether they will get to do they improve. Certainly the programs that focus on women's economic empowerment, there's very few that ask the question what the final outcome is. I wonder whether there will be
Yeah, so probably we will not have only studies that had as an objective female economic empowerment, but that could generate female economic empowerment as part of the intervention. Yeah, so it's not probably a direct effect or an unexpected effect.
Thank you, so interesting. I'm wondering about whether we can compare coefficients when there's endogeneity, because it requires self-selection to whether apply to a job or to be an entrepreneur first. And then, so you have risk adversity, so on and so forth. And then in addition, women face more structural barriers to probably to be an entrepreneur than to find a job, because it depends on asset ownership. So in some places in Latin America, but even more so in Africa, women cannot even have land ownership. So you cannot access a loan if you are not the owner of your land or have other assets. So there's like a lot of variables there creating structural barrier for women in addition to the endogeneity. So you're self-selecting to be an entrepreneur, whether there's no other option or you're in rural areas and there's no other way to go, or you are not risk averse. So I'm wondering whether, I know that there's many methodologies to standardize coefficients, but whether it is really possible to compare those aspects.
Absolutely right, and that is something that we are evaluating. So first of all, we have to see whether the studies are comparable and whether the measures that we get on outcomes are clean enough, whether there is bias, potential bias in the comparability. And when it comes with labor market outcomes, there is this double dimension that is not enough to have an intention to treat, but on top of that, there could be this self-selection into who takes the program. So at the best, we will do our best to take into account those issues, and if we don't manage to do a meta-analysis, we would be just doing a review in the sense that we will be commenting on what are the potential impacts and what is the evidence. So synthesizing the results without doing meta-analysis.
So one minor point, which is please, when you're doing these reviews of the literature, can you add the social science registry.org, which is now becoming the place to register your randomized trial. I didn't see it on your list, but
that's a good one.
and then I guess a plea not to do meta-analysis. A plea not to do meta-analysis. So I feel like when we have very different programs that are maybe implemented differently or just designed differently, if you just with a meta-analysis, you're basically just doing the average effect, and I think that's kind of meaningless. I think we get much more out of it if you look for common features across the things that are working. Yes, there's more judgment, but I think that's appropriate. So I mean, I could spend a lot longer in why I don't like measure. Okay, so my experience comes from looking at the education literature. So, and where there's a lot of meta-analysis, and what you see is people will average all the effect, all the programs that happen to have a computer, even though they're completely different. And what you well, not just different content, completely different programs. Like some use the computer in one way, some people introduce a computer but have no changes in pedagogy, they just introduce a computer and expect kids to do something with it. So what's the average effect between two radically different programs to me is meaningless, as opposed to, where I cut the data is what kind of education programs are teaching kids at the level that they actually are. Well, you could use a you could use a human tutor, you could use a computer, you could change the class size. There's many different ways of getting at the same theory of change. I prefer to talk through the theory of change rather than average two completely different programs, because then you just kind of get garbage.
It's not necessarily a question of like meta-analysis, yes or no, but it's a question of like how to do the meta-analysis. I agree with you, like throwing everything together is probably not such a good idea. But if things are comparable, why not do it? Like, studies, like if they happen to have like relatively comparable questions. So in the second micro review that we're doing, programs that can change that, but I wouldn't be saying don't do meta-analysis and but just do it right. But that's my response to that. And maybe the response to your point, like that we can't go like all the way through the causal chain. That's true, but like some of the indicators that Marcella mentioned and that I just mentioned, are like the causal link between those and a decent sense. So if we can like show the link to human capital, that's really good. If the rest is not out.
Thanks for your sympathy. I also am suffering it personally. So the months to come will be.
I prefer the question, and it's actually for everybody. Now, if it is true that there's very studies that meet the criteria for your systematic review, what are we then going to do? And the reason I'm saying that is most development agencies will have an incredible amount of knowledge on what women's economic empowerment programs have done. They just haven't. None of the development agencies ever consider doing any kind of randomized control, any kind of rigorous, just because that doesn't fit with their program. Not because they don't want it, but just it doesn't fit with their program. It's only very recent that some agencies now have started doing it, but it's often very research-led, right? I've worked in the development agency, and I can see, and I know why I didn't like it, because it just didn't fit with the type of program. If you do an integrated rural development program, you have a participatory approach in that, where you think you do very well on women's economic empowerment through the, but you never randomize that, or it hasn't been randomized because the setting of the program. So is there, so this is for the entire community, is there not another way in which one can get at that knowledge and make sure that it has, you know, similar criteria of quality of evidence, right? The qualitative evidence is not poor evidence, it's a different evidence. But that we can describe it in a way that it's made, you know, as close as credible as
Yeah, so you could have different types of systematic reviews. So you could also have a systematic review more on qualitative studies, and there would be other methods that you could use there, and there would be more like understanding what are the drivers. That is not our particular expertise, and that's why we are not going into that direction. But obviously there would be other methodological approaches to include that type of intervention and studies. So it's also, I think, to a certain extent, an issue for the researcher to decide which are the methods and the selection of studies that they want to focus, and we are experimentalists and believe in in that type of approach. So.
Finding female empowerment and differences in measuring this. I don't know, how many studies are we going to find in the end that actually match the possibility of this? I think it's perhaps on one hand. We're trying to do this. So that's an ambitious, very much of an ambitious task. Why is first draft December 2017?
So I don't think that is the case, and I think that we are not finding 5 studies with RCTs with an emphasis on female economic empowerment. So in the dimension of microfinances, there are many more than that. In the dimensions of childcare and access of job opportunities. No, so your concern. That's regarding a meta-analysis, and that's where the question comes. So probably we don't go so far as doing a meta-analysis, and for a meta-analysis is really something that we have to evaluate on the next months. But when it comes to a systematic review, it can still be done even if it's not a meta-analysis. And that's probably where we will end up. So we will probably not be able to aggregate over very few studies because it's just not possible. It's just not comparable outcomes, it's not comparable interventions, and we cannot put everything in one indicator. That's what we need to assess from now on. Thank you.
Next year. Thank you, everybody. It's been a long day, lots of information. I've learned a lot. I hope that the presenters benefited as much and everybody benefited as much as I certainly have. I'll pass on to Maria, who's going to give us more practical.
To do an evidence review for DFID was not a systematic review because they wanted it in 6 weeks. So yes, you can see we could do that sort of thing. Although we did start out with some of the same methods and keywords and all of that kind of stuff. Basically, the other thing that they wanted was the question was very broad. What are the enablers of women? Very broad. broad questions. So we started with kind of the systematic review, thinking that we just find studies, but so it's clear we can't do that with a broad question. But we have copies. We have like 10 copies here if anyone wants to see that, and it's also I think on the on box. So, but I was very humbled when hearing
thank you to everyone. I wanted to thank all the discussants and to encourage them to send their comments in writing. So that's it. We will see you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tonight there's no central dinner planned. Tomorrow night there's another one planned.